Welcome to Blind Shovel, an arts and music podcast. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with musician Anthony Ferraro. We get a little tangential, we get a little wild. Hope you enjoy. Hello.
Hello.
What's up, Tony?
Hey.
How you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, I just got back from a trip and I'm sort of recalibrating to domestic life, but it's nice.
What kind of trip?
A trip for a band that I play in. We just played a few shows in the Pacific Northwest and
Nice.
yeah, a little warm up run.
Do you like tour life? This is a thing I feel, it's not, as a visual artist, that's nothing you have to think about. You just kind of wear yourself with being in isolation and making things. But I find that musicians, especially at different ages, have very different opinions on touring.
Yeah, that's true. On the whole, I definitely do enjoy it. There are times when it's more difficult or feels more like a job. Like if you have to, sleep for 3 hours and then run to the airport to get to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, on the whole, it's really just a wonderful way to see a lot of different places and meet a bunch of different kinds of people from different, who are all coming from different places. So yeah, I would say I really do enjoy it. There were years where I was touring for, maybe 8 or 9 months out of the year. And that became challenging for relationship reasons and personal sanity reasons. But lately it's been more like maybe 3 months, cumulatively out of the year for, say, the last 5 or 6 years. And so that's a little bit more of a sane schedule and gives you a little more balance.
Yeah, I can imagine. So is that your main gig?
I guess if you take it by the percentages, yeah, it's probably the biggest number, but there's a lot of gigs. So
I noticed that, which is interesting.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good thing. I used to have shame about that. I have a lot of things going on. And I when I'm suspicious of myself, I view it as cowardice. But when I'm not, I'm kind of more celebratory of the many gifts I've been given, But I think both things can be true.
Yeah, I agree.
So what are these various things? I've looked at your website and your Instagram, and I'm not sure I fully comprehend it, which I'm cool with. But what are the various things you do?
Well, music is a big one in varying capacities, like tour. And then, I do a fair number of DJ gigs, both, kind of private event, higher dollar amount type things, and then more sort of for the art type DJ gigs that like at, you probably saw that I just had a DJ thing at SF MoMA, which was fun because it was just a really dialed in system in a very dialed in room, in an atmosphere that was very geared towards deep listening. And so being able to sort of pull from the collection and play more adventurous things or more contemplative things, that's always a treat. So yeah, DJing, touring, composition. I do scoring for commercial work and documentary stuff. Those are kind of my two main lanes for scoring. And then I do some production and recording for other people, writing on their music. And then I guess that sort of rounds out the music side of things. And then I've got a whole other I'm opening a bar. I'm sort of a closet programmer, and I'm, working on some stuff around sharing music and consuming music, and trying to interact with the current sort of splintered music consumption landscape in a way that feels like it's helping me make sense of things. So yeah, there's a lot of trails, a lot of breadcrumbs maybe for things that we could talk about. But yeah,
I'm immediately interested in the bar, maybe because as I get older, I'm just interested in like really practical business experiments, because I like the tangibility of failing in business. It's just very like, oh, it didn't work. And of course, even when it supposedly works, it usually fails. I just think like it's a narrow path, but what's this bar idea?
So I live in a town that's about 20, 30 minutes outside of like what you would call the main Bay Area. So San Francisco, Oakland. And so I'm sort of like in the area that's becoming part of the acceptable radius that people are willing to sort of travel to check out something.
Interesting. And what town is that?
It's called Vallejo.
Vallejo. Yeah, I used to live in Oakland for a while.
Okay.
I didn't really get too far out. I don't think I've ever been there. Is it on the line? Can you get there like via mass transit?
It's not on the BART line, and buses they're available, but it's a bit of a slog to get up here. There is a direct ferry to and from San Francisco, which is nice and sort of puts us on that map, and makes for fun day trips to the city. But yeah, it's sort of a town that's has sort of been perpetually on the cusp of pulling itself out of various abysses, I guess. Sort of like, municipal corruption, just kind of general dysfunction. It was a town that declared bankruptcy.
I didn't know that could happen.
Yeah, I know. I think it may be the biggest city in America that has declared bankruptcy. I have to fact check that, but I've heard that said. So there's sort of a lot to love. There's a lot that needs love here. And it was, an affordable place for my wife and I to move after we lived in Oakland for a long time. And sort of immediately became installed into this really great community of like-minded folks, a lot of artists, a lot of, just people who are trying to live fairly cheaply and be freaky and, creative in their own ways. Mm-hmm. So our friends last summer opened a gallery here, which is really, really great. And we are going to open a bar in the next door unit of the same building as her. So yeah, so it's sort of like a way of trying to sort of create a living room like a public living room, or third space is the phrase people use.
Right. It is a phrase.
Yeah. But yeah, it's pretty simple, like coffee and tea, beer and wine, and then a bunch of records and nice speakers. So sort of the listening bar format.
Oh, okay. Nice. No, I'm just curious, I think sometimes when you have, at least for myself, when you have all these divergent interests, as you get older, some sorting mechanism has to emerge. And so when I hear about a bar, I was just curious if it was like a practical financial thing, but it sounds like it's more of a communal experiment.
Yeah, I would say it's both. There's a sense in which opening like a brick and mortar, like a bar, a physical place where people are going and inhabiting, there's something that feels future-proof about that. In the sense that it can't really be automated away as easily. I think that that kind of human to human hospitality magic is here to stay, and there may become more of a hunger for that sort of thing. I mean, it's hard to extrapolate, but
yeah, I hope you're correct.
As someone who currently makes most of my living in the creative world, all that, the tectonic shifts in that world are pretty seem pretty big right now. I guess we'll see if that continues, but it does feel good, and I guess in a sense it's a bit of a hedge to have this totally different enterprise that I'm starting up. Though there are tie-ins with music. I mean, music will sort of be the centerpiece and the hearth of sorts. Like I like to think of the hi-fi system as a kind of hearth, like a communal focal point, and it's something that people can sort of orient around in a way that creates for interesting interactions, or just holding space together.
Yeah, no, I totally relate in the hedge aspect. For me, I started doing art fabrication with my business partner like 4 years ago, and just general fabrication. And it wasn't so much of a concern about where things were going societally, but for me, the lack of tangibility in drawing was concerning. The lack of, pushback from a physical reality like wood or other materials.
Yeah.
And then now I am heavily involved with an art center in my town, and that is a similar hedge. There's days where I'm optimistic. There's actually a record store and bookstore within it. So it's very interesting just to see what impacts people and how it impacts people, and trying to stay open to that. Because I think ultimately, as cheesy as it sounds, I'm actually increasingly just concerned about what makes a human, and less concerned about, the nature of art or the nature of good art. I think there's a more dire question to be asked now.
Yeah, interesting. I think I have somewhat similar goals in the sense that I hope that having a physical space can, there was a big sort of requirement for me. I have a couple of business partners and in this thing, but one of the sort of non-negotiables for me was to have it be all ages. So we're getting the sort of alcohol license that lets you also, have non-drinking age people in there. And I wanted it to be a sort of place where, high school kids could come and be exposed to some art that they wouldn't otherwise encounter, or just have a sort of like safe space that feels creatively invigorating, and just, a spot to hang out, because there's not a whole lot of spots like that here. But I do think a lot about the next generation. I love collaborating with people, 10 years younger than me, and trying to wrap my head around what it feels like to be a teenager or in early 20s right now. And tell me more about your explorations into what it means to be human. That sounds like a fruitful line.
Well, just like you were saying about, I actually view it as like from a scale compositionally within visual art, scale shifts are very appealing. You have like a little leaf here and a medium size and a big. I remember going to Disney World when I was like 25 for the first time and seeing, I don't know why it hit me, but seeing a parent and their child, and they looked very similar. And I was just aesthetically pleased by that kind of recursive nature.
Yeah.
And then I started doing shows here. Besides running the gallery, I ran a gallery before in this town as well. And underneath it, I ran a music venue in an old jail. It was like the original town hall. So there was like a jail on the bottom. And in that experiment, I found a similar thing, that I was very inspired by, just like kids being exposed to things I never was. And I'm not by any means complaining. Like I had a great childhood. I just wasn't raised in an art environment. And I'm actually very happy about that. I don't have art parents, etc. And so finding art later in life was like a really explosive experience. but yeah, just this looking at the contours of humanity, and like my comic work is very oblique and obscure, and again, like I might chalk it up to cowardice on a bad day. On a good day, I chalk it up to mysterious and I don't know, I guess more open-ended exploration. But as I got older, I just wanted to connect more to the people I loved. I think it was slightly regional. I used to live in Oakland, but I'm from New Jersey, and it's kind of unavoidable to be like, you just kind of marinate in the people around you. And I found myself more and more not around 20 somethings thinking the exact same thing about me with the same concerns. And I love that, like, I also love it from the perspective of being an artist in a town that doesn't have a bunch. It sounds kind of defeatist, but actually I think it's really affirming to one's identity and use within a certain context. So it's just like a suburban New Jersey town, it's not like an art hub, but that's kind of the mission with this art center, which definitely has this all ages energy. Kids love it. They run around all the time. And I just think that question, and I'm not talking like Blade Runner in the sense of like, what is a human? Like, I kind of am bored by that whole, what would you say? Like, replicas become so human that we can't tell what a human is.
Yeah.
I hope that it's a little more interesting. Like, I have a friend who thinks we will kind of discover our own souls via the process of going down this path of trying to create consciousness within machines. And so, like, for me, I'm also Christian, and increasingly so, in the sense of, I think it's very much a religion of what it means to be human, because God comes down as a human and he experiences humanity, which is a very bizarre idea. Like, that although there's something above you that's transcendent, it comes down to you to kind of empathize and share in that human experience. So yeah, I think as an artist, I can only speak for myself, I was subhuman when I used to make comics in a room and kind of shun the important elements of the relationships I was in. I know that's a long ramble, but that's kind of where I am coming from.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a few threads that I would want to pick up on. Maybe the juiciest is that I have a totally opposite, I guess, spirituality or metaphysics or whatever you'd want to call it. And it's interesting. It's been on my mind a lot lately because I grew up in a sort of conservative Christian world, and then became all sorts of other things. But lately, have sort of been really inspired by the idea of immanence as kind of the absence of, like, I don't believe in transcendence anymore, in a way that feels very affirming in a way.
Explain that to me.
Oh man, this could get really heady, and I could wade out into waters that I don't really know how to swim in. I'm still processing this stuff myself, but I guess two reference points that maybe can sort of be useful are, various ideas from Eastern philosophy, like the sort of like radical interrelatedness, contingency of all things upon all things and all that stuff. And then in the sort of like Western continental tradition, you have like Deleuze, who I just read an introduction to him, and so I'm seeing the world through those goggles right now. And I don't know, sometimes like you read an idea and it just rings you like a bell, and I just became like, I couldn't put this book down. I just became super activated by this sort of complex of ideas that was coming through it. And I wonder, so I guess to back up a little bit, and I don't know if this is useful or if, you can cut this out if you want to, but on like sort of a meta level, I'm curious how you ended up, I guess how Zach ended up giving you my name. And then I'm also curious about other people that have been on this show. Mm-hmm. Not that we have to talk about them one by one, but there's some people that I recognize that seem like they were from such different, I don't know, worlds, or, you know, even geographically, like people in Japan or what have you. Like Jesse, I listened to your conversation with Jesse, which was really great. I really enjoyed that with Jesse
Bulmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
funny one.
I also saw that you talked to BD 1982.
Yeah.
Who I've been a fan of for a little while now, and have sort of followed their label. And so there were these funny, these funny little winks that I was getting just looking through the folks that you had already spoken to. And, you know, I sort of expressed reservations about having a recorded conversation on the internet, just because, I don't know, I have funny feelings around permanence and around, being pegged as anything, and being unable to sort of be fluid with who I am and the ideas that people would think I espouse or not. So, you know, this is all that to say, like, every idea and, you know, I guess every little bit of philosophy or idea that I sort of take on or like wear, it feels very provisional and it feels very playful, and I'm sort of protective of that. And so, but you know, when I say things like I don't believe in transcendence anymore, it's almost like I'm trying it on and it feels really good. And so I think it's interesting to think about like references and reference, and when an idea really does light you up, or you like activate you or something. I imagine a referent like being lit up that was sort of just in the abyss before, and suddenly there's like a little quantum interaction or something, and it's like a part of your consciousness all of a sudden. But okay, so
well, there was two things if you'd like me to.
Oh, sure.
Answer them.
Yeah.
Well, Zach probably just knows that we could talk to each other and it would work. I think I was just asking Zach if there's anyone he recommended I talk to.
Cool.
I think it was that simple. You know, there's something he's intuiting there, surely. And then, I pride myself somewhat on like the notion that every person I meet is for a particular reason. So a lot of the people on this podcast are from very different times in my life, or very different connections in my life. And some I don't know, like you in this instance. In reference to BD 1982, that's actually my sister-in-law's cousin. And, you know, we're all just from like Wayne, New Jersey, which is a suburb of New Jersey. And then obviously Balmer, I used to draw a lot with in the Bay. And I try to follow a thread that is probably invisible to most, but is visible to me. So it's not completely arbitrary. I also don't think I believe in coincidence. So what's interesting is you might be describing I don't know if it's accurate to say like a more horizontal plane, spiritually speaking. But I try to adhere to a very vertical one. And by that, I mean, like I've always been just have felt the tremendous weight of meaning in life. And anytime I try to impose casualness onto things, it's been a disaster. And I've tried it, you know, like I dabbled, at least from the literary perspective, or in like Zen and certain Buddhist thinking and certain Eastern thoughts, but I concluded it was a reaction to my Roman Catholic upbringing, that I could put it on almost in the way you were saying, but that it was clothing nonetheless. You know, it wasn't like my bones and muscle. It was a thing on top. And at a certain point, I just recognized that for me, the only way through was directly back to going back into that thing and trying to, take that one path, almost like I was on a rail of some kind. So it's interesting that, potentially we end up in the same place, but we see things at least differently in that way.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there's a lot to recommend for, being able to grant that and to recognize the limits of how you perceive and all of that.
I think it also speaks to, like, I'm completely comfortable now with people trying to pin me down. I say things, like, if you know me in person, I say certainly inflammatory things or things that are meant to explore, and maybe I don't believe them, like you said, the next week. I don't listen back to these podcasts almost ever, and I don't really care if people want to go back through them and, like, point at a sentence. I think part of being human and accepting humanity is that humans are complex, and for me, I'm not calcifying, because that would be a negative, but I am developing more form as I get older. I was very formless in my 20s, and I started to feel like there was limits to that, because I think this is a pretty insane statement, but even from the perspective of love, there is some merit to predictability within your form, and there's security in that. It's like a form of sacrifice, I think. Like, I don't think I could support a family and be known in some ways if I retained the formlessness that I embodied in my 20s. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think I agree. Though I would find it difficult to specify where I am on the formlessness to spectrum. But I guess one question that comes to mind is, did you feel like it was important to go back to where you were coming from, metaphysically speaking?
Yeah.
Because you had come from there, and there was a history and a context in which you could sort of work yourself out, or maybe that's not the right phrase.
No, I think it's fair. It's a humble omission of incredible restriction, in the sense of, like, I was actually talking to someone earlier about this, and of course you may disagree with this, but I don't even believe that a Westerner can comprehend Eastern traditions that were like the way I put it is, books kind of give the illusion that you can enter into certain worlds, especially these deep metaphysical worlds. And I think that is an illusion often, especially when these thought systems that are deeply complex and obviously should be respected are born in thousands of years of these various environments. And then I'm just some dude in New Jersey. And for me, there was like a humility and an acceptance in going back to what I was raised as, and acknowledging kind of like those symbols are kind of embedded into me. I went to Catholic school till I was in 8th grade, and I didn't even see the magic of those things. I couldn't see them, actually, until I started to look back at them, and maybe in my early 30s. And so it's kind of an omission of, like, even like, obviously Christianity is super, super complicated. All of these things are very complicated. And I think as I got older, I became very interested in the restraints and restrictions. And one of those was just like, you know what, I could even go into all these denominations of Christianity, et cetera. But what's really important is not my particular opinions or feelings about this little tweak in this denomination, but being a part of a human community and honestly starting to build a foundation for my family in a practical sense. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it eloquently, but it really was just the sense of like, maybe I don't have a choice. Maybe I don't get to pick or feel out what suits me. Maybe I have to return to the thing I was, like the fertile soil I grew out of.
Yeah, I mean, there's the symbology that you grew up with, I think, will always have a certain resonance to it and be useful for those reasons. Would you say the same thing about someone who grew up in a non-Western country and didn't have that sort of native encounter with that network?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think
so.
So.
Not necessarily asserting like a universalizable truth to.
No, I don't think I'm comfortable asserting that. It doesn't make much sense to me as of yet. I don't really think. Yeah, I kind of believe there's one way. There's like one path, and that life is quite simple but difficult, and one must stay on that path. But if you look at it from a certain axis, there's multiple ways to get to that singular path that might be viewed as one line, if that makes sense. Like there's almost stacking paths on the z-axis, and there's different thought systems that can get you there. I guess what became appealing for me, besides being raised within it, is like, again, the humanity of the whole notion of Christianity is like, when you really look at the heart of Christ and what's being truly said, there's something just really surreal to me and radical, and first and foremost human. And I'm very into representational art. I really have had moments of flirting with abstract work, but I find it doesn't ring true. And again, I can imagine maybe you feel differently. Like I look at Rothko paintings and I'm just like, this is like bullshit. I look at Pollock and I'm like, honestly, I'd rather talk about the story of Pollock and how he's a drunk and how he gets in a car accident and how his wife helped him be successful. Like, I think for me, I have a very literal sense of narrative and storytelling and representation. And Christianity helps, like, as opposed to Zen, which is very formless, I feel Christianity is very much in that narrative. And you could argue it's anthropomorphizing God. I mean, in a sense it is, right? It's like, again, he comes down.
Yeah, totally. I think that's all of those things are correct. I think that Christianity is like a heavily narrative form of sense making and I guess collective sense making.
It's literary, where I can imagine music. Like, I don't really make music. I make it as a joke and for fun. Like, I always found it actually very freeing to make up funny songs, but music is this far more ephemeral thing. It can be captured, of course, and recorded, but
yeah. Well, you were just talking about representational versus non-representational visual art. An analogy sort of popped into my mind, where there are forms of music that I guess you could consider more narrative or representational, in the sense that their forms are they have precedent, like a lot of precedent. Like a pop song has a certain structure, and you can anticipate more or less where it's going to go. And if it doesn't go there, it's really just subverting the form. But it's just sort of re-entrenching the form by subverting it, in a sense. So there's those sorts of music that you can listen to and have a somewhat reliable experience. And then there's sorts of music, maybe more on the ambient side of the spectrum, or as you get further into noise, where maybe it could be analogized with the formless. And some people are uncomfortable with those sorts of music, not just because it might be abrasive or it might be boring, but I think because formlessness, it does, there's something that it elicits in people. And I grew up as a classical pianist, and so I was very versed in the forms of classical music, which, arose over a long period of time and have, I guess, in a sense, sort of converted into jazz and popular music in various ways. But I was very concerned with form growing up, because all of the music that I was exposed to and playing and thinking about was according to those forms. And so in college, I got introduced to certain things for the first time, like Ornette Coleman or things that were just a radical departure from that, whether it was, like Stockhausen, like weird electronic 20th century minimalist stuff or free jazz or what have you. And then I think it took some getting used to. And now I probably listen to that sort of music more than I listen to, so-called representational music, or it's at least 50-50. And I really do have like a genuine appreciation and like embodied enjoyment of the kind of formless stuff. And that sort of translated into me feeling at least that I understand, or at least can more appreciate the formless, like visual art or other sorts of media that, might be on the more formless end of the spectrum. And I'm not sure if that's, it's interesting to put the formless versus the form spectrum next to the human versus the non-human, and to sort of interrogate what that could mean. I don't think I have a strong opinion on whether or not that correspondence is true. Just, at first.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that is it's a good point, because it's kind of a weird question, but will AI be better at making, which of the two will AI be better at making? The kind of very rigid and form-based representational work that appears to be human-made, or, I don't know, like ambient, like Brian Eno stuff or something, because I think all artists are going to have to ask themselves, why am I not using AI in like 50 years? In other words, what does it mean to be human if that's what makes art interesting? I'm pretty sure it is, but let's assume, like, it's kind of a terrifying question. And, part of me, I'm becoming more comfortable with the realization that I'm going to have to become, like, all there will be left to do in 50 years is to live and love. And maybe there will be nothing left. Maybe art will be, I'm fine with that, I think. But maybe art making will just be, maybe the glorious phase will end. And I don't know, like, I just had a son, and I'm not one to get all wrapped up in, like, what will he have to experience in 50 years, but I'm certainly going to try to make him as human as possible. That's my goal. I think that's one of my central goals is
that's interesting.
Just be a human, please.
Right. It's there's so many places to go from there. I think that to answer the initial question of what will AI be better at making, I think it will be good, and is already becoming maybe good or convincing at making facsimiles of compelling narrative stuff that upon investigation they feel pretty two-dimensional and flat, but it obviously understands like the kind of like lexical side of narrative, and how a story works, or how a poem is formed, or what are the component parts of these various forms of media. I think that it will not be able to write compelling narratives, at least in the near term. And this is just me talking out of my ass, but
sure.
Just because I think that narrative is something that is very responsive to like changes in culture and experience and all of that. And for narratives to speak, they have to be reflective of certain aspects of experience, which are like contingent on so many things. And so I do think that it's humans still have the edge and will continue to for at least a little while, maybe a long time, when it comes to like forming narratives that feel alive or feel like they're really reflective of like what it's alive to be, or what it's like to be alive in the current moment. And then for the abstract stuff, I think that's probably a place where AI will be really good at making stuff that's compelling. And whether or not the reaction to that is to just not find that stuff compelling anymore, or if it just becomes so compelling because it's able to sort of maximize all of the compelling genes for the things that it's seeking. And then we just become so enamored by its creations. That's sort of the dystopian thing. I don't know if I believe that, and I don't really have any qualifications for making that for making that claim. But I guess I'm more sanguine about the sort of human machine interaction possibilities. I mean, I've trained some models on like corpuses of text and found that to be really interesting, and maybe sort of tying back to what you were saying your friend was on about when he was saying that we might discover things about ourselves by instantiating, quote unquote, consciousness or whatever into machines. I'm super intrigued by that, and I guess because I don't have any sort of commitments to a particular like metaphysical, a particular religion or spirituality or something, I do feel like a little bit more of a free agent when it comes to experimenting in those ways, and kind of being open to, I don't know about, surgically implanting things in myself, but maybe the rungs on the ladder on the way there,
right,
I could partake in. I don't know. I also feel I'm hypercritical about this stuff in so many ways as well, and so I'm definitely not just all in. But yeah, I think it'll be both things. I guess the good and the bad.
It must be. I think my biggest concern is that, I don't know how to word this. In a way, we as a humanity will become so two-dimensional that we won't even recognize the lack thereof within AI creations, maybe in 100 years. I think it's a big statement, but I do feel that collectively humanity's maybe lost its soul somehow. And
do you think it's lost its soul to a greater extent than it has been losing its soul over, say, the last 30, 40 years, just kind of watching culture, the way that culture has changed? And not to make any super normative claims about it.
I mean, like over,
yeah.
I mean, over a huge time span. Like, I don't know if I'm just romanticizing some past, but maybe my soul, like, what became very evident to me upon seeing my child is, this is maybe, I don't know the last time I had a kind of unmediated interaction with true fundamental reality. And by that I mean something that potent, that it was just me and him. And I feel like prior humans had those kind of interactions more often. I mean, the amount of control we're under in certain ways is enormous. And I think it's only going to increase with AI. And so I'm not even suggesting that people were more moral or ethical or something, but I do think that there was something more grounded and fundamental about what they were experiencing. Could be completely wrong, of course. I don't know how to word it, but I just feel like there's a doling of something.
Yeah.
Within the human project, there's some kind of sleep occurring, and
sure.
And I think it's undeniable. There's some kind of technological lullaby at play, and I don't think it's for, like, I could evoke WALL-E. I think WALL-E is a good movie, and I think what is interesting about it as a film is it's willing to depict a pretty serious current problem in a futuristic way, you know, when everyone's just like a blob and they're drinking soda and they're like in their pleasure dome. Surely you've seen Wall-E, right?
Oh yeah, I think about it all the time.
Like it's it's like a pretty obvious observation, but that seems to be increasing to me. I mean, obviously I find hope within many people, but there seems to be there's something occurring, and I don't know. You know, obviously there's a Nietzschean idea of God is dead and we've killed him. I think about that notion quite a bit, because there's many interesting things to be considered, especially the fact that we could kill God. It's kind of a funny idea, but yeah, I don't know. When I held my child, and even when I look at him today, it's like, again, because I said earlier, I have this hunger for true meaning that I've had from a young age. There's nothing quite like it. And again, there's that concentration and embodiment of love via the child. Like, again, in this kind of Christian sense, it's not formless, it's formed. And now I have to worry about it. I have to worry about every waking hour of its life and try to foster that. And I think there's a tremendous beauty in that vulnerability that occurs in that embodiment. But again, in the same way of like, it's not a calcification. It's almost a representation that, yes, of course, there's risks to that, and there's benefits to formlessness at times as well.
It's interesting to think about what you're saying about what makes humans human, as relating to the sort of embodied experience of being alive and being just very physically grounded, and having your attention just be fully in that experience, because that sounds like an experience that's common to, and if I'm mischaracterizing, let me know, but that sounds like the experience that's common to all animals, right? Of, I guess, the reflection upon having the experience is what is if we're saying, and maybe this isn't correct, but if we're saying that, you know, animals for the most part aren't reflective, or at least not to the same degree. So I guess
there's a detachment to the human experience. There's especially to the artistic experience, actually.
And so what makes humans human also includes like our ability for abstraction, because that's sort of what's going on with reflection, is there's like a processing of experience as it's happening. And then to sort of like be a little more provocative, abstraction is what AI essentially is doing, right? It's abstracting away the sort of like art making functions and code writing functions and languaging functions into these models that are able to reproduce those functions. And, you know, there's the Alfred North Whitehead idea of, you know, civilization advances based on the number of operations that are able to be carried out without thinking about them, or more eloquently said than that. But we're from a certain view, we're advancing along the abstraction trajectory, and maybe to an unhealthy degree, and maybe to our own demise. And I'm totally willing to grant that that's, you know, there's going to be a lot of unpleasantness and weirdness and confusion to come. So, you know, we could also just be on the edge of a phase transition where, not that everything would be great on the other side of it, but at least things would be somewhat stabilized, or there would be a substrate on which to sort of build personal sanity. Whereas, you know, recently it feels like things are in such a state of flux that's less realistic.
There's a lot there. That's a good point. I think what first comes to me is that like the idea of a soul is actually kind of a captured abstraction, or even the Holy Spirit, like in the Trinity, the sense of the Holy Spirit's interesting. It's kind of like the Spirit of Christ between two individuals or more. It's like the connection, the it's not a technology, but it kind of feels like that in some way. And I would agree that no, I like the idea because there's the primal experience of holding your offspring. I think it's more than that, but because I think it does, I believe in a soul, and I think it does have something to do with those things connecting. But the soul is very bizarre, or the spirit is very bizarre, tethered to some other place. It seems to me that maybe that's what I feel that AI is how would you say, colonizing in some sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but obviously we're just spitting. I'm still processing a lot of it's intuitive. And what I have found really wonderful about re-entering into Christianity is it's a call for me to open my heart, not my mind. And obviously there's a lot of exploitative things that can occur when one closes their mind, but I personally was born very intellectual. I'm not saying that as a compliment. I'm saying that as, there's people who are more physical, there's people who are more mind-oriented, etc. And it doesn't call me, Christ isn't telling you to read more books and go to college and get smarter. He's saying to open your heart and be compassionate. And at least for me, like that's very much helped me balance some imperfections I have. And it also kind of soothes me from like, okay, sure, AI can beat this guy at chess and surely it's smarter than me. But at the end of the day, will it have heart? And obviously heart is a very strange concept. Like the heart is just an organ that's bizarrely shaped and keeps me alive. I still to this day find it. There's also very interesting images of Christ where he's like opening his chest, but his heart's in the middle. I find it very, very like centered. It's very fascinating to me. I wish there was a religion of gut biomes. Maybe there will be soon. Maybe there is. Maybe I don't know about it. But there's never, I don't know. It's like we do often, and I've certainly participated, live in a cult of the intellect and rational thought. And it became very clear to me at some point that there was some real true limits to that. I still think that rational discourse, thought, etc., is very, very valuable and necessary. But it's not a God, it's not God itself. There's logos and there's the word that permeates reality itself, at least in the Abrahamic religions, which I think is a fascinating idea. But at least there's been moments in my life where I misproperly worship or value rational thought in a computational sense, if that makes sense, like in a robotic way. You can be right. Of course you can be right. Like I'm very good at arguing and being right, but it doesn't do me any good. If I ignore my heart.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of ways into that experience of surrender, and the experiences that one would include under the kind of religious peak experience umbrella. And like you were saying before, different ways to the same path, or however you want to characterize it. And I guess it sort of became a non-starter for me to consider that any particular one was worth subscribing to over other ones, I guess, because I was just so fascinated with the idea that there was a sort of, something that was meta to all of them, that was common to all of them, that could be explored. And that in some sense, that's sort of maybe our responsibility going into the future is to find points of contact cross-culturally, cross-ideologically, points of contact that, not that we all have to become the Borg or merge or anything, but to sort of foster a mutual understanding that all of this stuff is kind of culturally contingent, all the things that we're arguing about, and particularly when it comes to religion, there's a lot of things that feel so culturally specific, but that the idea that there could be, that one could have the experience apart from being in a particular religion or believing a particular creed, that you could sort of access that feeling of surrender, or of opening your chest and feeling the full weight of what it means to be alive and all this stuff. I think that that's possible, I guess, and I think that there's I think that whatever a given person needs to achieve that, like, more power to them. Like, they should, if someone has truly found their way there and is experiencing that, who am I to say that they got there the wrong way? I just would hope that they're not trying to universalize their experience to the degree that it makes invalid other ways of getting there. And so there's a lot of people I admire who have, are Catholic or Christian, or have become that recently. Like, I've read a few Byung-Chul Han books lately, mm-hmm. and then learned in an interview that he was Catholic, and I was like, oh, that's just an interesting data point. But I sometimes, when I read things like that, I wonder, okay, so how deep does that go? Or maybe that's the wrong way of phrasing it, but would you say that you're Catholic and that that means that not to be Catholic is incorrect? Or does that mean that you're Catholic, and I'm asking Byung-Chul Han here. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that you're Catholic and you recognize that that's sort of the heuristic that gets you to that place of surrendering to, to life, or what have you? But that there's also a sort of meta recognition that there are all these other ways there. And so you're not quite biting the bullet when it comes to, the verses in the Bible that say anyone else who's trying to go about this a different way is wrong, and according to certain readings is going to hell, or it's just like never going to be able to have the experience that we say we have the sort of exclusive right to have. So
I think this may be contradictory, but Christ himself pushes it into a territory where it becomes the latter in the two things you just mentioned, because what's so fascinating to me about him is, like, Judaism is very law-based in a very kind of legalistic sense, even morally speaking, 10 Commandments. And every time that he's basically persecuted because he does good deeds on the Sabbath, or it's so fascinating to put these two books together to me, because he's subverting the whole thing. Like, every time there's a rule, he's kind of radically overturning it.
Right.
And so for me, it's like this very interesting cycle that doesn't allow you to be static or complacent about your beliefs. That's at least how I read it. And if you fall into this sense of judgment, I think Christ, in a sense, is always there to prevent you from being legalistic about it. And, sure. And when you're little, you get very legalistic. At least I was. Like, you're trying to find your way, so you're kind of playing with this binary. But once the magic emerged for me of the whole thing, it's almost psychedelically complex to me. And I mean, you're told to not judge, and that doesn't mean don't discern, but I think don't judge is somewhat of an admission of, like, this life is so deeply complex and we didn't create it. So who are we to make these judgments? And obviously Job is about that, right? Like, Job is a book that I think even non-religious people think is fascinating, because it is. And central thing there is like God is like, you can't judge anything that occurs to you within this life, good or bad. You don't have you're not equipped to make such a judgment.
Right.
And
like a Taoist.
Yeah,
it's essentially the same thing. I think, I guess, and it's funny. It's like I keep trying to, throughout my life, the way that I think about this, because it's the world that I came from, I do keep trying to pin down where exactly the threshold is between, because there's certain phrases or verses, even in the New Testament, that are pretty undeniably setting the bounds of what is acceptable to believe, and the punishments for those who don't. So there is the whole age of grace thing that's somewhat dissolving the legalistic aspects of the Old Testament, but then there's still some stuff in the New Testament that would make you think twice about not being a Christian if you were growing up in 100 years ago and you were in the parish. Yes. And there's sort of still a fear element that's part of the whole thing. And so I guess I wonder if, for people like you or for people like Byung-Chul Han, if there's a literal belief in the veracity of those elements. And I'm not trying to pin you down and get a straight answer out of you. It's probably less specifiable than what I'm asking, but I guess that's the part where it becomes difficult for me to wrap my head around being in that frame of belief. Or
no, I understand. It's bizarre.
So
I know it's boring. I think I'm definitely opposed to the hyper or infinitely permissive depiction of Christ, because I think it's actually inaccurate. I think that's where like the form comes into play. Like there is form and void in this, and at least in my opinion, Christ is a rather beautiful embodiment of those things. He's not ultra like you can do whatever the fuck you want, but he kind of is actually. For as much as I make a statement, it's almost like I can never sit in it, because there's notions within this where it's like, as long as at the 11th hour you accept me, then you go to heaven. And that like pisses people off, so someone can murder hundreds of people, and then if they genuinely enter into this in their last day here, they kind of, it's all good. And I think that's interesting to me because it kind of subverts your own personal judgment about how things should work. And that, I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, totally.
Yeah, I feel that when you take it seriously, you really cannot sit comfortably in any position of judgment of others. And I know everyone, there's cartoonified representations of this, of course, but yeah, I will say one thing. There's a great French philosopher called René Girard, and
yeah, I've read a bit.
Yeah, what he, his notion of anti-myth, that I used to do a lot of, like, again, approaching from a comparative angle. What are the shared elements of these religions? Eventually it turned into, okay, so how do they differ? And what are the differing outcomes spiritually, morally, etc.? And the idea of the anti-myth from him really shocked me, that in myth, there's a kind of assumption of guilt that occurs where, if this god kills the other god, it's not really like we're concerned about the innocence or guilt of a Greco-Roman god. It's just playing out in a kind of soap opera way. But that Christianity is identifying the scapegoat mechanism that is common to all human experience, because we can't figure out the root cause of things. So then we try to pin it on someone or something. And the idea that it is a religion that says we have to transcend or get beyond this thing, and God came down as an innocent man and was killed because of every single tendency we have, like the passion is just, if you see yourself in it, it's just interesting to me. Like it's just fascinating. I think, at least for me, it works to observe my own negative propensities in that light. And I just think it's a tremendously beautiful idea that we should recognize the scapegoat mechanism and we should do our best to stop it as best as we can. Obviously that it gets subverted and perversely used. Carl Schmitt talks about, basically, he's like the philosopher who informed the Nazis. Like, it seems like he just openly exploited that scapegoat mechanism because he thought it could galvanize people, which it does.
Right.
Which is very dark. You know, it's dark because it's true, I guess. Like, we see it all the time with the internet and things. Like, the scapegoat mechanism is very powerful and gets people very excited.
Right.
But anyway, it's a fascinating topic. But I'm kind of curious, unless you want to say more, like, I'm curious what kind of music you make and what form it takes based on this conversation. Like, is it, because, like, of course we make things, like, I do certain illustrations that are more formed in a way because, consumers consume certain things, and I don't denigrate them for consuming certain things. Typically, I think there is something to be said for what people are attracted to, but in your music practice, is it as formless as I'm led to believe via this conversation?
It runs the gamut. There's formed stuff and there's formless stuff. Yeah. The balance is, I guess, always vacillating, but these days, pretty even. It's easier for the formless stuff to take on a kind of, to hit you in like a spiritual register, because you're not, I don't know, maybe because the state you have to be in to really register that stuff or to really experience it. I think it requires a bit more openness or stillness or a certain kind of attention that you don't necessarily have to bring into the picture if you're just listening to, like a pop song or something. It's almost like the work is done for you to some degree. If you're listening to something that's carrying you along its form, but something that's more formless might require some interaction or participation on your part, even if the music isn't changing, but it's sort of inviting you to change how you are in the room, or what you're thinking of, or the sort of temporality that you're in, how quickly you're thinking, or if you're thinking at all. And I think that, all music is super culturally contingent, and I think about that all the time. Even stuff that feels like it's universal to me is still, in the 12-tone system, and it is adhering to all sorts of like invisible guardrails and precedents that I can't even be aware of. And so, yeah, I used to think that there was a sort of like Platonic sacred music that one could hope to sort of to make, or or at least to try to approach it. And that's, I guess, more of kind of a vertical, like you were saying before, a vertical conception of music. Now I don't really think that's true, but I think that there are maybe like attractors, or like some kind of, I keep coming back to this Deleuze book that I read, but like little like eddies that that will arise, and that can be sort of tapped for their what's a good word for it? Kind of like, not enlightening potential, but there's a nectar to be wrung out of them while they're in their temporary form. That sort of like moment of grace that this like eddy of aesthetics sort of exists, and you can kind of tap into it, and then maybe it won't speak in 10 years, but there's, you were able to sort of resonate with it while it was there. So I guess, I have this, these days I've been making, to bring things back down to earth, I've been making some kind of like ambient music and music that's sort of like club music, but reflected off a bunch of surfaces, or not like club music that's meant to be played in a club, but more just tying into certain aesthetics and playing with them a little bit. And so that's kind of what I've put out most recently. And then I have the sort of pop practice, if you will, that's more formed stuff. And I have a bunch of material that will come out later this year and early next year that's in that vein. And then I just have like some solo piano work. I probably have like 5 or 6 different monikers that I sort of flit between. And I went a good few years without really making any music.
That's cool.
And then got back into it early this year. So it seems kind of funny to even talk about what I'm making or what I think that I'm making right now, because things can change pretty quickly. But that's
what did you learn from not making music in the last 2 years? About music.
Yeah, I learned that it's really important for my sanity to be making it. And whether or not that's a problem is sort of, I guess, irrelevant to some extent, because it's, at least it's true now. But I did have a lot of time to think about how I wanted to approach it, and if I wanted to approach it in the same way that I had been approaching it before. I
think it's healthy. I think it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, I agree.
It's like not dating, people with the propensity to like keep dating 3 months later or something, but to not do so for 2 years is a far more illuminating practice. And I don't know, you get to see. I always like to prod myself and be like, do you need to do this? Do you need to make art? For me, there's always like this, and I don't want it to be a compulsion either. So there's like this kind of dance I always try to do where like I don't want to feel that it's just like another distraction, I guess, from my impending doom. I want to know that I'm meeting it on its proper terms with due respect.
Yeah.
I think not doing it often illuminates that.
Totally. The more, I guess, the older I get, the more I think about music or art making and art dissemination, less as, they're useful for sort of personal discovery and kind of iterating on your identity and all of that. I think that's super valuable. But I guess I'm more interested in its sort of communicative potential and its art's ability to kind of like constellate groups of people, especially given the internet and given I have like a network utopian streak, and I'm constantly in contact with people, internet friends from all over the world, some of whom I've met in real life and many of whom I haven't, and, working on projects with them, working on music with them. And I think that art is a really great and sort of affective, often nonverbal way of broadcasting, like on a certain wavelength. And maybe that's a really narrow bandwidth, or maybe it's, maybe you're broadcasting, maybe you're Taylor Swift and you're broadcasting on a really broad bandwidth or something. But I do like to think of it as a way of finding people and a way of assembling in a way that can, lay the groundwork for more of that to happen. Yeah. So sometimes when I'm making stuff now, I'm like, who do I want to broadcast to? Not like necessarily who do I want my audience to be, but who do I want to like slide into my DMs and, ask if I want to collaborate on something. That's almost the most like validating or, the greatest sense of confirmation that I get is when someone whose art I maybe wasn't aware of, but, they reach out to me and I look at their stuff and it's like, oh wow, this is incredible, or this, this music is incredible. There's kind of like a holiness to that, where there's like this system of abstractions that we all have differing understandings of, but there's enough overlap to where we can usefully communicate with it. And then every once in a while, you're able to like have the experience of really just like resonating with someone or with a small group of people, and then something like beautiful results from that. That's almost like all of the metaphysics that I need on most days. Just like, maybe nodes on a network resonating in like serendipitous ways, and that's like maybe enough for me. But it's funny because when you say that meaning holds such a, it's such a big thing for you in seeking meaning. I feel the same way. Like, my sort of like, I resonate when you say stuff like that. And then the more that I interrogate what that meaning is, or like what the word meaning represents to me, I never really, it's sort of like fractal. Like I never really get there. And so,
it's a type of like spiritual weight to me in a way, like, and maybe that's a Christian thing, right? Like the cross is obviously heavy, or well, it's not meant to be heavy, but it's a heavy object that can be carried in a light manner. But yeah, when I was little, I was like, I would say I was haunted by meaning, and thus when I entered into high school and the frivolity that is, I really struggled. I couldn't understand why that person dated that person, but they kind of like didn't, like, it was just like, oh yeah, well, we're going to date for like the summer, like 3 months or something. And there was almost like an open acknowledgement of this casualness, or, I was anthropologically interested in what was going on in these circles, or even later in my life. But at my worst, I was certainly crushed by meaning. Now I don't feel that way at all. I'm blessed by it because I can't imagine the opposite. I think it's a nightmare to feel that your life is meaningless. That sounds horrific to me, but maybe that's just how I'm oriented,
Yeah.
We all want to meet. It's very weird, right? The word is strange, and I think it has narrative implications, actually. I was going to ask you, like I've always felt mythological. I've always felt that I live in a narrative, and I've always felt rather concerned with the mythology of how anything came to me or starts. I think I never use a dating app because I think it's mythologically bunk. Like I don't want to. I don't want to. That's not how the story starts, And I could never take something seriously that has started in that fashion. But I'm curious if I think narrative is ultimately unavoidable. I'll use the example again that I think Pollock's life story is more interesting than his paintings. And I think often the stories we tell, process, conceptual things, etc., are often more interesting than a lot of modern art itself. And I think that's only reaffirming the power of narrative. And ironically, when I made comics, they're not anti-narrative, but they're more musical than they are narrative. So I don't understand how that happened to me, but
it's funny. There's a funny I'm going to try to put this into words. There's a funny Ouroboros moment that just happened between what you just said and then what you said earlier, and I think it's something like you were trying to differentiate narrative from I guess formlessness before, and which I agree with as narrative is obviously sort of like form definitionally, but then you were talking about how contemporary art became more about narrative as the literal form of the artwork, sort of and it became more about concept. But concept, and is maybe just another way of saying narrative. So there's this funny, maybe paradox that may not need to be resolved, but to there's like the concepts part of modern art that persists and maybe is more resonant with the experience of being alive now than the idea of a physical object that has form and is representational or what have you. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. No, I don't know why I'm struck by I just thought of the beginning of the Bible. Like, when's the last time you read the beginning of Genesis? It's fucking an insane.
Yeah,
weird.
20 years ago, hard to say.
Like, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I don't know. That's just popped in my head, but there's such weird phrases there. The face of the deep. What's weird to me is that it's very, like, I already see a lot of form in that statement. It's almost, but this idea of the earth was without form and void. I don't know. What's crazy to me is, like, I'll read. I'm sorry for the tangent, but there's something there to me. The relationship between form and void there is just, like, really musical and interesting to me. And
yeah, I mean, that's the whole kernel of so much of, like, Eastern thought, is really just trying to wrap a head around the relationship between those things, and in some senses them being the same thing, and in other senses them being different. I think that paradox animates so much of like world religion. So
the reason I think of it is, like, this interplay between, it's maybe a ridiculous analogy and I may just be tired, but, like, the way art can, these things play in different ways. And obviously conceptual art, like, I've always found it distasteful in some ways that the words are so, it's disingenuous to me how much it leans on the words. Because then I always thought you should just write an essay. But I'm just very kind of rigid about, like, visual art. Like, sure. I want to see you draw and paint. And then theater, it's ironic because I actually love cross-disciplinary stuff. But I think categorical integrity, form, is very important to me. Like, I think the erosion of categories has gone too far, largely speaking. And again, it could just be, like, my Christian upbringing, but even this initial sentence, like, just this visual of not destroying the void, obviously, but there is a kind of obliterating aspect to light itself. And it is interesting how some Eastern thought, like, darkness has a very different connotation. Mm-hmm. And Christianity is so heavily about light,
right,
and revelation. Although, again, like, there isn't too much light is obliterating. It's kind of blinding. But a normal amount reveals all the form present. But I don't know. It's interesting how there's polarities in this dance. It almost feels to me like, obviously, unaware of each other. I think these thought systems kind of just, like, magnetize off each other. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a beauty to that, actually. I think there was more beauty when they had their own integrities. I think the mush of modernity is very disconcerting to me, and I think that's why I grasp at straws for form. Like, I don't need more void, frankly. I need as much form as I can get, because I feel that the ground is just falling out from under us in a lot of ways. And I guess I'm willing to go to war with that void, the artificial void, not the spiritual void. I think, like, there's destabilizing forces at play that aren't spiritual. They're manipulative, and yeah, I think more and more I seek the sacred. I seek that verticality. I seek profound connection over casualness. I don't. I really. Yeah, like there is no like the problem I have with kind of hyper contingent stuff is like I don't really like fuck with coincidence, you know. The profanity of that is disturbing to me, and I feel like there's been an ever increase in profane spaces, and that less and less we even identify sacred spaces, and that concerns me deeply because I think that's why there's something lacking in a lot of my human like I try to pull things out of people sometimes, and there's just like feels like less vertical. I don't want to be diminish people, but again, I think there is a doling of something, and I think that doling is kind of reducing the vertical bandwidth. It's just kind of like there's not as much. When I think of my ancestors, I'm shocked by what they had to live through, and I'm not romanticizing it. It's just like I cannot believe even what my grandparents had to live through. You know?
Yeah, totally. It boggles the mind.
It's insane. But it's it's a kind of like unmediated, like life was happening to them, where I feel like now we try to control the speed at which certain things come at us, and we fail, obviously, eventually. But now I'm just rambling, I admit.
Yeah, well, as you were talking, I just was thinking that I've thought all of those things too before, and it's funny. I was kind of just impressed with the fact that I guess I'm on the other side of the fence from you in a lot of senses. Though something I have a suspicion that's true in the way that we're talking about things, but in terms of a sort of like qualia of experience, there's probably more overlap than we could like language, because I do. It's funny to try to imagine a sacred space that is secular, right? So,
oh yeah, please.
There are places that, I mean, if you go to a good rave, like maybe that sounds like totally ridiculous, but I'm thinking about it because I'm going to one this weekend. But there is a kind of like beautiful mixing of sacred and profane, and I guess maybe that's oil and water to some people, but I guess coming out of a very restrictive kind of renunciative upbringing, I, of course, like pendulum swung in the other direction, went down the whole kind of like existentialist rabbit hole into kind of like nihilism for a minute, and then, you know, started to cobble things together a little bit. But I guess I have a lasting fascination with the idea of there being a sort of inversion between sacred and profane, or this interaction with them. And I think that to some extent that can be modeled even within a person as a sort of like shadow integration stuff, or this these parts of these strains of psychology that have to do with like incorporating the darkness or the things that are in the unconscious that aren't addressed otherwise. And so, you know, like one of my favorite quotes is Philip K. Dick, who is a personal hero of mine, a totally insane individual in beautiful and unbeautiful ways. But he said, the symbols of the divine first appear in the trash stratum. And I just fucking love that. That's such a great, I think as soon as you stop looking in profane spaces for sacred things, it's sort of like they become invisible to you, or they ossify, like the symbols that you're used to ossify and are no longer alive. And maybe there's an illusion that they are, or they're sort of held in place by collective, sacralization or whatever, to kind of imbue them with an energy that can be experienced in a collective way by, say, a church or something. But I think that the actual kind of like relevance of those symbols to what's, really going on, to not that anyone can know that, but the sort of real metaphysical resonance of the symbols has maybe departed. And at that point, it's time to go digging for new symbols, or it's time to like open your eyes to where that energy has sort of like located itself. So
I agree. It's a very delicate dance between, I think we should all refuse to be foot soldiers in one side of the equation. Like, I think it's a big mistake to identify, and I'm not talking politically, as a conservative or a liberal or a progressive, etc. Like, those set you up for a kind of failure. You kind of have to do both simultaneously in respect to tradition and innovation. And the worst artists are only on one side of the fence. They are rigidly adhering to tradition, or I think rigidly adhering to innovation in a way that kind of is arrogantly dismissing the work of one's elders. And I think that's what's missing a lot often, is an embodiment, a holistic embodiment of the paradox of life, like, I have my own opinions about secular spaces and their propensity or ability to access the sacred, but that is very complex. There is an Eric Fromm book called The Art of Loving that addresses the different means by which one might access transcendence, and it kind of gets into what you're talking about with the rave, and it's very interesting. Highly recommend that book. For him, the highest thing in life is to stand in love as opposed to fall in love, to consciously embody the discipline of love, not to be taken over by some passion of love, but to act in a discipline of love. And he addresses the idea that primal cultures would engage in ecstatic rituals that would dissolve them into each other. Kind of these, like what you're mentioning here. And even drugs can do that, or alcohol, or certain, like I go to a fucking football game and I feel that way, or a mosh pit. And I think rightly so, what he's being critical of, and like this would track, I don't believe he's Christian, but that the highest embodiment is both a dissolving and a formed experience. So like, in a mosh pit, I would feel like my lines would blur, and I'm sure in a rave similarly, right? But to consciously embody love is to be yourself individuated, but to kind of ooze out from yourself in that kind of Holy Spirit sense. And to me, that is very beautiful. It's like, I think the ecstatic rituals are a little too heavy on the dissolution of the individual. And so I've always loved that idea that, like, even in a relationship, one must retain themselves for it to be successful, but one must share themselves wholeheartedly. And even in art, I think that's true. Like, to be consumed by the process, like Jung would talk about almost a possession, there's a true danger there. And there's many artists who are destroyed by the process. But I think it's that dance between the two that really should be sought.
Between disillusion and
because one is dissolution in some sense is reaching out beyond yourself.
Sure.
But I think there's many people I've known who've done like certain hallucinogens to such degree that they've dissolved themselves. And I had a friend who said something very wise to me, that he didn't believe in a soul until he saw people do drugs enough to not have one. And I think he was talking like a very extreme examples. And I was like, oh, I understand what you mean. Like, I used to live in this rave house in Oakland called Mr. Floppy's Flop House. And yeah, and I don't do drugs. I would drink. That is obviously a drug, but I mean, semantically, you know what I mean? And I would encounter many people there who I was like, oh God, I feel horrible. Like there's something gone and I don't know how to explain it. I don't know if you would agree with that, but there is a way one can dissolve too much, I think.
Sure.
For me, yeah.
I would agree with that. Yeah. I think that it can be a helpful exercise to have experiences of disillusion if you have, certain defenses or you have too many boundaries or something. You can glimpse that it's possible to be more permeable as a person or as a being, and I think that's valuable. And you don't want to completely dissolve those boundaries, but you want to understand that they're there for certain reasons, and then they can be lowered maybe, and you can become a more loving person, or you can sort of follow those cues.
I think what's interesting is like I'm experiencing that dissolution in an embodied form with my son. And it's my wife, I have a stepdaughter. So she had said something interesting to me beforehand. It was like one of the first times she saw her daughter, she was kind of like, I'm fucked. Like now the thing I love most is outside of me and in this world. And, that's so beautiful to me because of that vulnerability, which is really interesting to me. Like, I think a lot of this conversation is about that, even, we were talking about like your reticence about recording things in general or podcasts. And I think that's what the theme of this conversation is, that interplay between form and void. And, there's something just wild about that recursive nature of family, the melody, the repetition. It isn't a surprise to me that it's been a thing that is held sacred to a lot of people.
Yeah,
I know people have very varying opinions on it, but
in affirmation of what you just said, of that experience of vulnerability and form versus void. Man, we've really got heady.
yeah, it happens. It's all good.
I think that experience is the experience that's common here. Maybe that in a term that I like to refer to it is surrender. And that was sort of planted into my brain. Maybe during a conversation I was watching with Brian Eno, where he was sort of puzzling about the idea of, he loves sacred music. And when you're listening to like a great gospel record, you just, to actually experience it, you have to surrender to it, and you have to feel, you have to open your chest, you have to feel that vulnerability. And I think that's the stuff of life, like, absolutely. And if I ever have kids, I'm sure that it'll be that compounded, by a huge coefficient. So yeah, I try to practice that feeling of surrender in various ways throughout, my day and my week. And there's a sense in which it feels like the ground floor of reality. And so to sort of bring things back around, to me, surrender is sort of formlessness coded in a way. Like they're almost synonymous, or surrendering to a form feels like a contradiction in terms somehow to me. But that could maybe open up a whole conversation that we don't
Well, so tangibly, because of when we get too out there, we gotta come back down.
Sure.
But so where can people listen to, like, under what moniker? It sounds like you have many in terms of your music.
Yeah. Well, the most recent thing It's called Interloper, and it's I put it out under the moniker Tony MF.
Mm-hmm.
And then, maybe most appropriate for this conversation, I put out a solo piano record a few years ago that is more on the contemplative side of things, and it's something that I point people to if they seem that might be their cup of tea. So maybe those are two good starting points. And yeah.
Okay, so you got that, and then you have several other projects. They should just go to your website and your Instagram.
Yeah, everything. Well, not quite everything, but most things make their way onto my site, which is tony.news. But yeah,
that's pretty solid. You got tony.news. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it was available. I've had it for a little while, but it's a fun one. It makes things easy.
Right on. But good to meet you.
Likewise. Yeah.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Music by Dori Bavarsky and Mingja Chen. I hope you have a wonderful week.